Okay, hi everybody. I did the carbon cycle for my cycles paper, so I'm going to go ahead and go through some of the things that I talked about in that. So here's a quick overview of the carbon cycle. Carbon is an essential element and it's found in pretty much everything, and it's recycled and reused naturally through a process of dynamic equilibrium, and it stays in the closed system of our planet. So, to go through the cycle a little bit, we'll start with plants. Plants can capture atmospheric carbon by using photosynthesis. And, say, for instance, if this vegetation is eaten by an organism, the carbon's passed along the food chain to the next organism. And if that organism, say, this cow over here, dies and begins to decompose, some of the carbon is lost in decomposition, and then some of that decomposes further into the soil, which creates the soil carbon that we see here. So in the natural carbon cycle, this soil would get packed and buried underground over time, and it'll eventually become inorganic carbon deposits in the lithosphere, like coal, oil, natural gas, all of those things. And much of our planet's carbon is stored in sequestered rock, too. So normally, this form of carbon would find its way back to the atmosphere through something like an erupting volcano or other natural sources of carbon release. And the ocean also acts as a natural source/sink, so it can diffuse carbon dioxide into the ocean when CO2 levels are high in the atmosphere, but when gas pressure of CO2 is different or lower, it can diffuse CO2 back out. So, the natural carbon cycle's role in the atmosphere is also really important in figuring out the temperature of the Earth. So, for example, when CO2 concentrations are low in the atmosphere, this can cause atmospheric water pressure or water vapor to come down as rain, and that can bring cooler temperatures with it. But when concentrations are pretty high in the atmosphere, water vapor can accumulate in the atmosphere, and it really just exaggerates all of these heating effects. So anyway, not too long ago, humans uncovered sequestered carbon and began drilling and digging for it and releasing it into the atmosphere. And this really threw off the natural rate of the carbon cycle. Um, and I included this graph. It's from 2018, but it's a graph from Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, and it shows the monthly average CO2 concentrations in ppm, or parts per million. And we can see that the natural cyclical behavior of carbon has really just shot through the roof as humans pump more sequestered CO2 into the atmosphere. And we've seen also that natural systems can't really keep up with this, and plants and animals can't adapt quick enough, and our planet is warming. So carbon sinks like forests are really disappearing at an alarming rate from deforestation. So they're not really able to help absorb and recycle some of that carbon. And warming temperatures are also causing a lot more wildfires, as we've seen. And that contributes to massive CO2 releases as well as ocean acidification. And all of these things are really creating a positive feedback loop that worsens the carbon cycle's imbalance and exacerbates global warming. So, a research study that I looked at compiled the key findings from 13 different studies, and it looked at the biological changes in Nepal. And this found that a lot of species of alpine trees were projected to shrink in distribution, so in numbers, and shift northward due to the changing climate and the warming and the more intense seasons. So, in another similar study, 90% of a community of endemic alpine plants in the Himalayas actually were seen to shift up in elevation due to rising temperatures brought on by the imbalance of the carbon cycle. So, as we've read in our book and seen in class and everything like that, a lot of species are moving northward, either towards the poles or upward in elevation to kind of get away from the rising temperatures. And growth rates in Himalaya fir trees have been negatively affected in response to the rising temperatures, and they're under a lot of stress from moisture, so moisture stress because of the extreme seasonal variations. In the pre-monsoon season, it gets really dry, and then during monsoon season, it gets really wet. So each species showed a really high vulnerability to future changes in climate. And then lastly, the future of the carbon cycle is really heavily dependent on human actions now. And we've seen that natural systems such as healthy forests and vegetation, oceans, different spheres of life, they all have the ability to absorb and recycle CO2 and other greenhouse gases within the planet's closed system. But given the deforestation and ocean warming and acidification and just monumental amounts of fossil fuel combustion, they're creating further disparity within the carbon cycle. So, to close out, carbon's really essential, and we need to find a way to adapt and to mitigate these changes by sequestering carbon, replanting vegetation that can help, and stopping the burn of fossil fuels. Thank you.